Donald Trump treated us to the spectacle of the red carpet treatment for Vladimir Putin last week. How will Zelensky be received by the US president today? We'll also be talking the future of the Tory Party and the economy in this week's Downtown Den Politics podcast.
The return of the sausages.
All sorts of things that I would have wanted as a kid that I couldn't have, right? Famously, Sky TV.
How'd that happen? I guess I just forgot what was going on.
They're eating the dogs, the people that came in. They're eating the cats.
Yay, it worked.
So welcome back to the Downtown Den Politics with me, Frank McKenna, with Joe Phillips and Jim Hancock as ever. And of course, we talked last week ad nauseum really about the meeting that was going to take place between President Donald Trump and Putin. Of course, that event went ahead. And before we get into the weeds of what really has resulted from that particular get-together and the meeting that's going to happen today with European leaders Zelensky and Trump, let me just ask you guys what you thought of that spectacle of Putin's visit to Alaska, which Trump actually thought was in Russia. At one point, he said in one of his press conferences, I'm off to Russia to see Vladimir Putin. So he'd obviously forgotten that that land swap had taken place many years ago. Yeah. Jim would have reported on that. Indeed. I think it was about 1836.
1861, actually.
And joking aside, I don't know about you guys, but I found the whole thing rather sickening, actually. We've talked often about European leaders, our own Prime Minister included, being a little fawny over President Trump and careful about what they say and how they appear to be a bit, well, sucking up to him, for want of a better phrase. Bloody hell. I mean, Trump and Putin, red carpet treatment, limousines, press conference in America, led by Putin. I say press conference loosely because there were no questions allowed after Putin and Trump had addressed the journalists. And at the end of it, what did Trump get out of it? Well, Putin said, well, I'm keeping the land I've got. Ukraine can't join NATO. And by the way, whilst we've been having our chat, we've been bombing buggery out of Ukraine. Joe, it was just an incredible, as I said earlier, spectacle, really, wasn't it? And for Zelensky and the Ukrainian people, they must have been shaking their head in despair.
Oh, absolutely disgusting in so many ways. And, if you compare and contrast with Zelensky's treatment in the White House when he went there in the early spring, I mean, he was basically ejected from the White House, while Putin is treated to this red carpet treatment. But I think Ben Wallace, the former defense secretary, described it very well on the radio yesterday. And he said the thing about Trump is he wants the spectacle. He loves the occasion. He's a man who's interested in the wedding, but not the marriage. And I think that is a perfect description that Trump has had this meeting. He's got, everything he does, every time he opens his mouth, we all follow it. The media are there, but nothing happens. And he's too stupid or too vain and surrounded by yes men and women to recognize that he has been played again by Putin.
Putin did make him look like an amateur, Jim, didn't he? Putin came across as the grown up in the room, a real president, if I can put it that way, whereas Trump just looked as though he was a bit doddery, actually. I mean, if it had been Biden, and again, I know I said in a sort of jokey way, Trump confusing the fact that he was going to Alaska, which is in America, saying he was going to Russia. If that would have been Biden, the Republicans and the press would have been jumping all over it. Trump, as ever, just sort of is able to flop these things off. But do you think that Putin is basically played Trump like a fiddle, and today we will see the conclusion of that with the United States president insisting no NATO membership and Crimea stays with the Russians?
Yes, obviously it's a moving story, and it's fascinating that the European delegation have gone en bloc to support Zelensky. So one sort of thinks that even if Trump's been played along, that they're not going to be played along. But just briefly on the spectacle, there was no need for a red carpet. It wasn't the conclusion of a thing which had been worked out, and this was just a formal ceremonial end of it. The Americans could have insisted that everyone arrives in their limousines straight outside a modest, well, the military base, but the limousine draws up, they go inside without photographs and handshakes, but to put out the red carpet when this Russian dictator is happy to lose, I think, 1 million of his citizens in this futile war. It was just awful, and there are some signs that the MAGA base is beginning to revolt against this spectacle. But turning to the substance of it itself, I mean, as far as we can anticipate, it does look as if the deal is that I think all this will be de facto rather than de jure. De jure is a final settlement. De facto is like Korea is de facto split between the two since 1953. So it looks as if the Donbass and Crimea have got to go to Russia, including parts of the Donbass that the Russians haven't even conquered yet. And then no joining of NATO. So that's a pretty big pill for Zelensky to swallow. But just moving it on a little bit, it's going to be absolutely crucial what security guarantees are given to the remaining 80% of Ukraine against what is highly likely to be a further Russian attack in a year or two when he's got even more of his people lined up to be slaughtered. And that's where some interesting questions for Keir Starmer and President Macron and so on. I mean, okay, if we've got to not formally let them into NATO, there has to be a guarantee, which is almost like Article 5, in my opinion, by the European allies in particular, but supported by United States Air Force and satellite communications, that if there's any incursion into Ukraine, then that is effectively Putin should realize it would be war. Now, are we up for that? And I'm not sure. Maybe you can help me. Have the British people been asked whether we would actually put troops on the ground to police the new Ukraine? And would the British people countenance a war, possibly a world war, to save Ukraine? I don't know what the mood of the British people is. And finally, of course, the cost of it, because we're going to be coming on to our economy later on. I mean, and if the British people are equivocal about it, and I'm not being critical of public opinion because it's a huge ask, but if they are, then we're in very great difficulty. If Europe hasn't got the will to more or less replace the Americans and to support the rest of Ukraine being a viable state, then this could be a black day indeed. Sorry to go on.
No, there's a lot to unpick there, though, Jim, but you've summarised where we are very well. I think the first thing I'd say, if I was Zelensky in Ukraine, I'd be very nervous about any guarantees that we're going to come out of today's discussions, given the fact that in the 90s, when Ukraine gave up their nuclear weapons on the basis that they would receive that NATO umbrella defence, that has not been forthcoming and has been flaky at best. And of course, you can say that had the Republicans not won the presidential election last year, then we may be in a different place. But there didn't appear to me to be a particular appetite from the United States to go any further than they were going. There were all these things put on, weren't there, in terms of blocks and barriers as to what that weaponry that the United States was sending to Ukraine could be used for. So in answer to your question, Jim, I don't think there is support from the British people to enter into war directly with Russia. That doesn't mean that there is not support for Ukraine, but it's how far that support goes. And for me, I think that Zelensky taking the coalition of the willing, as they've become known, is a good move because it at least stops the humiliation that he suffered last time, as Joe referred, just basically frog marched out of the White House after that awful meeting he had with JD Vance and Trump. But I can't see, given everything that's been trailed thus far, how even Trump is going to be able to backtrack on some of this stuff. How is he going to go back to his mate Putin and say, well, I tried, Vladimir, but here we are, and America are going to continue to support in the way that we have previously. Trump's tactic today, I guess, Joe, is to say to the Europeans, well, if you want to carry on with this war, you pay for it.
Yeah, which is, and it's a point of view. And that is, you could argue that is slightly better than, no, I'm not going to support you. I mean, I think the show of support in terms of physically being there, accompanying Zelensky, is huge. It's unprecedented. And I think it sends a very clear signal. The problem is Trump doesn't give a damn. He might be all over he might be all over Starmer one minute, but then he's all over Putin the next. You could say the same about Netanyahu or whoever it is he happens to be meeting. I mean, A, you can't trust Russia, and B, you can't trust Trump. So, Zelensky is absolutely stymied completely. I don't, and unfortunately, because America holds pardon the pun, the Trump card on them joining NATO, it makes it very difficult. But I do think, Ukraine could be fast-tracked as part of the European Union. They've been trying for that for ages, and I know there were concerns and worries, as with their membership of NATO, about corruption. Well, that's still going on. That's why Zelensky's trying to deal with it. But we know it's still a problem. But in the grand scheme of things, actually, isn't it better to have Ukraine within the European bloc? And, of course, it's going to cost us. It's going to cost all of the European countries a fortune in military defence. I mean, as to asking the British people whether they're ready to go to war, well, you don't ask the British people. That is the job of government to decide that. We weren't consulted on the Falklands, and all the people who protested against going into Iraq were completely ignored by Tony Blair. So I don't think that really amounts to a hill of beans, because I do think public support, as you say, Frank, it is behind Ukraine, but whether we want to get our hands dirty or our hands bloodied even is a different matter. But I think the British public don't like bullies particularly, and what they've got is Putin, the absolute archetypal little man, bullying Trump, who is looking more and more ridiculous with a very gammy leg, if you ask me, coming down those airline steps. And nobody likes to be bullied. I mean, we don't know what will come out of this meeting. It may be that, Starmer and Rutte and Meloni and Macron will be frog marched out of the White House along with Zelensky, and that's it. I don't think that will happen. But it's very difficult without anybody around Trump who is a voice of common sense, who he might listen to, because I don't, he's made it very clear this morning in overnight capital letter diktats, green ink, that the ball's in Zelensky's court. It's up to him to end the war. Well, why? They were invaded. It's utterly ridiculous.
Yeah, I mean, the rewriting of history that has been undertaken through the Trump administration is remarkable. But I think the other thing to say is that, interesting, the characters that are going to be around Zelensky today, and obviously we see Starmer as being a key player in this because he has got a decent relationship with Trump. The one person that I think it would be interesting to watch is Meloni, because obviously politically she is far closer to Trump than any of the other European leaders that are going to be present, actually. And you do wonder what her attitude is going to be. Let me just put the alternative argument to you guys here, because obviously we're talking very much pro-Ukraine and anti-Russia, and nobody can make any excuses for the way in which Russia have executed this conflict for the past 3 years or so. But what Russia would say is that if you look at that country's history, they have had millions of people lost through invasions and incursions on their land in the past. They need to protect themselves. That when the wall came down in 89, a series of gentlemen's agreements were made with Gorbachev, which suggested that the Eastern Bloc would not be part of the European Union and would not become part of NATO. And so what Putin is doing actually is correcting deals that have been reneged upon. Okay, albeit gentlemen's agreements, but nonetheless, if you were Russia, would you not have some right to say, we feel threatened that this country that borders us is going to be allowed to join NATO, given our history, given our past, and given the fact that our understanding was that Eastern European countries were not going to be allowed to join NATO. Jim, what's your response to that? Because that is the Russian argument, isn't it?
Yes, it is important, and it's very valuable that you've put this historical context on it. I need to do more research into what happened in the Yeltsin years, because that's what you're referring to.
Yes. Yeah. It would have been Yeltsin rather than Gorbachev, wouldn't it?
That's right. That's right. I mean, because Gorbachev fairly quickly disappeared, and it was Yeltsin presiding over it. And of course, the context of it, I mean, in a way, things were so quiet that one wonders why the Baltic states actually joined NATO, because the Russian Federation under Yeltsin didn't provide any military threat at all. So it is fair to put that point. But I mean, the only thing I can say in response to your very good outlining of the history of it is, if Russia has a problem, there are ways of trying to deal with it, which certainly falls short of military force of the most violent and horrible kind. I mean, it's a serious problem, because we've got so many cases now of the violation of the basic laws of war in Sudan, Gaza, and so on. But this is the alarming thing, that the institutions that are meant to be recourse to resolve issues of concern are being completely bypassed in favor of military intervention. So that's the sort of response to that. But I mean, it is important to put that side of it. It is important. I mean, there are issues about the way in which the pro-Russian guy was defeated in the 2014 elections in Ukraine. There is the issue of why did the Ukrainian leader try and undo the corruption laws the other week? I'm not saying that Ukraine is spotless, but resolving this by military intervention is not the way. And the final thing to say, of course, is that he had a country, Ukraine, that well, certainly in the west and center of Ukraine was not keen on Russia. But now he's got a country that's absolutely determined, and history moves on. That country now, because of the way it's been treated, wants to be independent. Whatever understandings Russia had in the 1990s, what Putin has done is completely counterproductive to what he could have done, is to try and, move Ukraine into his orbit through economic links and all that sort of stuff. And over generations, they might have reconciled, but the military intervention wasn't the way forward.
I mentioned Ukraine. I will also extend that, and I think I did say the Eastern Bloc, Joe. And if you look at the encroachment, and I'm trying to be as objective as I possibly can. I take everything that you say, Jim, in terms of the way in which Russia have executed this conflict. But if that agreement with Yeltsin did take place, that the European Union and NATO were out of bounds for the Eastern Bloc, and then slowly but surely those countries have been allowed to join the European Union, the big one would be Poland, I guess. The other argument I've heard put over the weekend is that one of the reasons that the European Union is struggling is because it got too big, too expansionist. So these arguments and debates and discussions are forgotten about because we just focus and concentrate on the horrors of war, and that's understandable. But sometimes you do need to look at the context of these disputes and say, have we got this right every step of the way? Doesn't much help in terms of the conversations that are going to take place today. But my guess is that there are many people around Trump who will be saying, look what happened in the 90s, Donald. Look what happened in the early noughties when Europe was just land grabbing, taking the Eastern Bloc, which previously had been seen as part of the USSR, and at the very least, they would have anticipated that those countries were going to stay neutral.
Well, yes, I mean, it's a fair point, but where do you stop on going back to history? I mean, Hungary was occupied by the Russians under Stalin. We've got all sorts of. You only have to look in sort of relatively recent history to the former Yugoslavia. Once a communist stronghold, and then absolutely fragmented into the most ghastly civil war that amazingly didn't spill over into the rest of Europe. But we did actually send troops. The UN were there as peacekeeping forces, and although it's fragile, very fragile, there is some sort of end to the killing. And I think you're right, Frank, that yes, there is a context where you put all of this. But the trouble is you can't have those sensible arguments with people like Putin and Trump. And the problem with Putin is, and I think you've identified it really, is that he wants to have the former USSR. He wants to have that vast empire. And again, historically, it's a huge landmass, but it is not economically hugely powerful. No. It has got, a very, very challenging geography, if you like, even though it is rich in some minerals and other sort of natural resources, but it's not a great fertile land. And I think, also if you're looking at, well, okay, you leave Ukraine out, but you let Estonia in, where does that leave countries like Poland, who have been invaded before? And we saw what happened then. Then the Germans, the Nazis came marching through Europe and got as far as France. Well, are we going to say, okay, right, we don't want anything to do with this. Ukraine, you deal with Russia, and we'll sit here and hope that Putin doesn't go, actually, I want to go back to the days of, before Jim was even a boy reporter, and turn the whole world Russian, because otherwise we might as well go back to the Franco-Prussian Empire. And are we going to get the Belgians reclaiming part of the Congo? I mean, we are, to use that terrible phrase, we are where we are. And if you're going to use that argument, well, you could put a lot of focus on what's happening in Gaza and Israel, actually.
Yeah. Well, listen, there's a lot of people out there who'd love to see the old British Empire reform. I can use that phrase, reform. But these are serious points that are made by serious people and commentators at times, to say that, to use that phrase, we are where we are, and actually we've got to accept some responsibility for that. Nonetheless, the way, as I say, and Jim made this point, the war has been executed, no excuse whatsoever for that. And so what do we expect? What do we anticipate from today's discussions? Interestingly, Marco Rubio, who is, I think, the foreign secretary that we would sort of identify in that role in the States, was once a massive opponent and critic of Trump, but now is, bent the knee and is in the administration. But he was saying over the weekend, Jim, that you cannot trust Putin, and therefore whatever agreement is done, or we hope is concluded today to some advantage to the Ukrainians, needs to be cast iron, and Putin's feet need to be held to the fire as far as that's concerned. And Rubio seemed to be keen to give the Ukrainians that protection of not formally membership of NATO, but, as you say, the Article 5 security. Now, is that the way in which this war is going to be ultimately resolved? And one final point before I finish, Jim, and I'd like to get your reflections on this. If Trump really is determined to get this deal on the stocks, on the book, so to speak, do the coalition of the willing or Zelensky have a choice other than to say, okay, yes, Mr. President, let's go forward on this basis?
Yeah, I think they'll be anxious to try and sign up for whatever has been agreed. I mean, if I was trying to forecast, and of course I could be proved wrong within hours, it looks as if the shape of the deal is that Donbass and possibly even the unconquered bits are given to Russia de facto and Crimea. The Russians might withdraw from one or two of the southern provinces, to some extent, Srebrenica, I think it's called. But what we haven't talked about is whether Russia is being appeased, but nevertheless brought to a conference table that the Europeans might sign up to with regard to mineral rights. I mean, you know already that Trump has got to deal with Zelensky about minerals in his part of Ukraine. But of course, the Donbass is very rich in minerals. And if there's some sort of deal there with Russia, because I think Trump wants to move on, Trump wants to do a trade deal with Russia on a broader basis to try and draw it away from China. I mean, that's the broader global picture. So I think the Europeans are going to be put. It's a terribly difficult position. I mean, you both sort of outlined the people that Zelensky couldn't trust, the Putin, he couldn't trust Trump. And the question is, can he trust his European colleagues? And you've discussed the British people don't have an appetite for it. The only thing I would say to you, Joe, I mean, obviously it doesn't require the consent of the British people for us to go to war with Russia, but I'm just saying it would be, given the fragile state of the British economy and Starmer's natural reluctance to be a warmonger, it would be handy to know whether he has the British people behind him or not. I absolutely take your point about vetoes and so on, but public opinion can help to inform governments in a highly difficult situation. So I think, to answer your question, Frank, there'll be a huge wish, and you mentioned Maloney, very good point, a huge wish to try and sign up for this, because if they all come back in a state of disarray, Putin's had his red carpet. And the other thing we haven't even mentioned, he's continued to shell Ukraine over this weekend.
Yeah, I did say whilst they were actually having the conversation, they were bombing hell out of Ukraine. So, Joe, let's just finish with you. What do you think may be the outcome of these conversations? No, it's difficult to predict, but let's get your crystal ball out and tell us where you think it's going.
I think Ukraine has lost Crimea, that's for sure. I think the idea of Ukraine giving up land that has not been conquered is absolutely appalling. The problem is, whatever agreement he comes to, Zelensky has then got to go home and face the Ukrainian people, who will, a large majority of them might say, okay, any deal's better than continued killing. But as with all wars, hundreds of thousands of people have been killed and injured. The cost of rebuilding the country is phenomenal. And people will quite rightly say, well, what was all that for? At which point he is in a very perilous situation, at which point Putin then works his magic, puts his own placeman in position. Zelensky's gone, remembered as a fantastic hero who strode the world stage and had a bigger impact than most people do in one lifetime. And Putin then gradually takes over Ukraine, rubs his hands with glee, and moves on to the next country. And that is the problem. And that, I think, we've got sensible people in Starmer, in Mark Rutte. I think Macron is good. I think Scholz is good. I think Maloney might actually be the person to play a blinder on this. And I think it might be, if they can persuade Trump, and this is the challenge, that he is being made to look a fool, that's the only thing that will appeal to him.
Yeah. Well, we wait and see the outcome of today's conversations and discussions. I've been sort of refreshing Sky and BBC, and nothing's happened as yet. So I guess that all those world leaders are arriving. I think Zelensky's already there, actually, in the States. And we see what the outcome will be. After the break, we're going to talk about all things domestic. So we're going to look at the Conservative Party, which I promised last week we will do, because people have been telling me we don't talk enough about the Tories, so we will put that right. And then we'll talk briefly about some rare good economic news for the Chancellor this week. So stay with us. We'll be back in a moment. Welcome back to the latest episode of the Downtown Den Politics podcast. Me, Frank McKenna, joined, of course, by Jim Hancock and Joe Phillips. Just before we continue our conversation, a reminder that there is a podcast available to you, an interview that I did with Louise Ellman, the former leader of Lancashire County Council and the Liverpool Riverside MP. Fascinating 90 minutes I had with her, so please do have a listen to that. Right, let's move on then to the Conservative Party, which is, well, languishing in third place in most polls, tottering between 13%, I've seen them as low, but usually 15 to 18% poll ratings. Kemi Badenoch, the snitch, as Joe ably described her last week. Was it what was it? The snitch.
The snitch and the atheist.
The snitch, the atheist, and the woman who ate sandwiches. So there you go. That clip is for all to see on our TikTok channel. But she is struggling, and I've been reading lots of various features on her, including an excellent sort of 6-7 page feature in the New Statesman, where the guy did what they did with Starmer, actually, follow around, try to get a take on what she's all about. And the conclusion that most of these commentators have reached is she's not up for the job. And actually, most of her MPs don't think she's up for the job. And the membership is certainly itching for a further change. Of course, on the back of that, we see the emergence of Robert Jenrick, who finished runner-up last time, and we'll talk a bit more about him in a moment. But let's stick with Kemi the Snitch, Jim, and get your views on her, because out of the three of us, I think you've been kinder to her. And on a serious note, some of the policy pronouncements she's made, I think, do make some sense. So, for example, she's been brave and said the triple lock needs to go. For example, she has said we need a big reduction in welfare spend because we simply cannot continue to spend this much on welfare benefits. She's also said to Wes Streeting, you've got to start to reform the NHS far quicker than you are if you're going to pour all this money in. So there's some things that she said that you think, yeah, you could be onto something there. But I think her big mistake, Jim, was saying we're not going to look at any policies for at least 2.5 years. If you're the opposition, you're just not going to get that sort of time. And also, her performance as the Prime Minister's questions have been pretty poor as well. You give me a more positive assessment of Kemi Badenoch's time as leader of the opposition.
Well, I have done further canvassing of my view that calling out someone who's cheating when you've done all the hard work to pass an exam, I have gained some supporters in the last week or two who are rather astonished at your indulgent attitude to cheating, and indeed the nations. But overall, I did think it was a reasonable sort of interview. But I don't want to give the impression that I think that she's cemented herself in power as the leader of the opposition up until the next general election. Far from it. It's quite clear that there is dissatisfaction in the Conservative Party, and whether we like him or not, there is at least one credible alternative. And this is the thing that Kemi Badenoch always has to fear: is do you have a credible alternative? And there are at least two. I won't even mention Mel Stride, but. The two, Robert Jenrick is clearly on manoeuvres. I mean, it's quite clever in a way. He's keeping a high profile during August by doing these what you can call stunts.
Well, let's come back to him in a moment.
Yes, okay,
stick with Kemi.
Yeah. So so she's not making a mark on the opinion polls. And more seriously, of course, reform is still storming ahead. We see the business sector beginning to show interest in what their business policies might be. And that's a real sign that they're being taken seriously. So we then come to the question about when is Kemi Badenoch going to face, her ultimate test. Now, obviously, an abysmal performance in next year's local elections, which are more in urban areas, so are not favourable to Conservatives, might be the point where the party takes a decision. But you may feel, pointing to the things you've already referred to, Frank, that she won't last until next May. So I didn't want to give the impression that I think she's doing a wonderful job. I mean, it's a difficult job, as William Hague found out in 1997. It's a damn difficult job. I think she's slightly improved her Prime Minister's Questions performance, but not enough. So, I think I would come down on the side of when, not if.
Yeah. I mean, just to put this again into context in terms of supporting cheaters, I'm not going that far, but I think if she'd have been a bit more critical of Boris Johnson having parties during lockdowns, which was a far more serious offence than a 15-year-old kid cheating on an exam, an O-level, I think I'd have more sympathy for her. So, as I say, let's put it into some sort of context. I just think the optics of somebody sitting in a television studio when she's got, a great opportunity to sell herself, pointing out the fact that, when I was a kid, I did this. And then, as Joe pointed out last week, and by the way, I'm an atheist as well, for good measure. And if you like sandwiches, fuck you. So, for all those reasons, I don't think that interview that you were saying, Jim, was a good interview, did her any favours in the end. But can she survive to those local elections is the question, Joe, because November is now the time that the Conservatives can trigger a ballot. So they gave her this sort of grace period of about, 14, 15 months, said we can't have a challenge before then. Or does she get to the party conference and perhaps, people have said she's got this in her, say, well, bug you. I've done what I can. I've tried to be myself. It's not really working. And the other strong rumour is she's not particularly enjoying the job. And Jim's already said it's a tough challenge and it's a tough old job. It's not the best job in the world, leader of the opposition, is it? So she might just get to the party conference in Manchester and say, I've had enough. Over to you.
Yeah. And actually, that would be quite a smart thing for her to do, rather than to be ousted, because the Tory party will be struggling with, oh my God, can we have yet another leadership election? And then you're probably going to have, Jenrick, who desperately wants it, but not as much as Mrs. Jenrick, and James Cleverly, and you've got one there that might be able to rebuild the sort of centrist, more moderate One Nation Tories under it's Jimmy. He's always talking about Tom Cleverly, James Cleverly. Or you've got
not anymore, but that's another story.
Or you've got, Jenrick going in the other direction towards reform. The problem with Kemi Badenoch is, and I completely agree with you, Frank, I mean, she does say some, quite sensible things. And actually, I think having a commission to look at human rights and our membership of the European Convention on Human Rights and all of that stuff, it's a good thing to do. She's not saying we're coming out. She says, I'm looking at it. The problem, as is so often the case in politics, is in her manner. She is abrasive. She comes across as though she's not interested, either in policy or the detail or the big ideas or people or the media. And so you sort of wonder what made her stand for the leadership. Who is she talking to? Because it's never clear. Keir Starmer is often talking to either the Labour Party or he's talking to the public. Boris Johnson was talking to the world and the media. And, Kemi Badenoch isn't talking to anybody particularly. And what's more, she's so apparently busy to not go to meetings with either activists, fundraisers, donors, or even JD Vance. So she's left a vacuum, not just in terms of policy, but in terms of, well, who's going to fill it? Hello, my name's Robert Jenrick. Who went to have breakfast with JD Vance? Jenrick, because apparently Badenoch and Vance's diaries didn't work out together. Well, she just doesn't seem to cut it, and her manner is very unfortunate. And the other thing to add to her being a snitch and an atheist, she's now disavowed her Nigerian roots, much to the fury of two leading Nigerian commentators. One woman columnist called her a serpent that breathes poison and spews illness into the world.
Oh, well, what a fabulous reference. I don't think politically that ever does anyone any favours. So I'm not a Nigerian, wherever but you've got to say, haven't you? Even if you don't think it, right? I'm proud of my roots. I'm proud of where I've come from, and I've developed into this personality, at least partly as a result of that Nigerian birth. Of course you have. I've still got the Bootle book in me, and proud to say I have. And it's just daft. That as I say, you do wonder whether she's got any politics. Missing the Vance meeting as well. I totally agree with you, Joe. Just bad optics again. However, that does move me on to Mr. Jenrick, because not only has he had dinner, lunch, whatever it was with JD Vance, but apparently he's been having many a conversation with Osborne and Cameron. And it was Osborne that actually arranged the meeting with Vance, because Osborne and Vance are big mates from American University, I guess. So Jenrick, I think, would certainly be the favourite going into a new leadership election if that's where the Tories decide to go. Would Jenrick make much of a difference to their poll ratings, do you think?
Well, I think if we're agreeing that Kemi Badenoch is a transitional leader and sooner or later it will end, I doubt if she'll actually walk away, particularly at the time of the Conservative Party conference. I mean, that is, to whatever extent it is, the sort of showcase for the party, and to spoil it with a drama like that, I think is highly unlikely. But this would be, in a sense, after the transition of Kemi Badenoch, this is a fork in the road for the Conservative Party. This election, which we presume would be between Cleverly and Jenrick, really would be a fork in the road, because they've got to decide what they're going to do. Are they going to try and provide a credible alternative to reform by being a pretty right-wing party, not aping everything of reform, and particularly as far as the business community is concerned, saying that you do know what the Conservative Party historically, not in recent years, but historically, is a strong institution that supports business but governs from the centre, or whether it's going to go after the reform thing, and that would be the choice. Cleverly would take them in one direction, and Jenrick in the other. It's a question of how fearful they need to be about Reform UK, which is a huge force operating to their right. I guess, one sort of thinks that after an initial spasm of support for Jenrick, that the moderate centrists in the Conservative Party will decide that James Cleverly is the man to take them to a more conventional position, but they then risk, of course, leaving the ground open to reform. So it would be a really important election, and I venture to suggest whoever was elected in that election would take the party into the next general election.
Well, that's an interesting point to make, Jim. I've been told that the next leader of the Conservative Party will be the transition before the return of Bojo. So we wait and see, don't we? And Johnson, amazingly, is polling better than any of the shadow cabinet, including, of course, Jenrick and including Badenoch, which isn't surprising. But he's been on manoeuvres the weekend. Joe, he's been up to one of the asylum hotels. Yeah. Which apparently when he was immigration minister, he signed off on.
Yeah.
So the Labour Party have been having a lot of fun with that, and inevitably so, because obviously he was immigration minister for some time and the numbers were rising and spiking. What I would say to the Labour Party is this thing about hotels is really pissing people off. And, I've talked about optics a lot this morning. As optics go, asylum seekers in hotels is awful. And so Jenrick and Farage are onto something here. Not quite sure what the government can do, because some of these things are signed. These contracts, some of them are 3-year contracts. And I know that the government have looked at trying to get out of some of them and they're struggling. My temptation would be to rip them up, but then where do you put these people? You're not going to put them in hotels. Where do you put them?
Detention camps.
You've got to find a solution to this, Joe. And I think, as I say, as much as you can sort of point out the hypocrisy to an extent of Jenrick, he's already said, well, I was under pressure from the Home Office and I didn't want to do some of these things. He's moved on. The Labour Party have got to as well, I think. So Jenrick would be favourite, wouldn't he?
He probably would. He certainly has got a knack for getting publicity. He apparently tackled some dodger on the London Underground a few weeks ago, and he turns up at this hotel protest. I mean, it's very interesting. There's a little bit of a row over the weekend with some leaked WhatsApp messages. With new Tory MPs, hard to think of how many there are, but I guess you can count them on the fingers of one hand, saying that the campaign against the hotels was stupid and reminding Central Office that actually the Conservatives were the people who brought that about, signed off the contracts, including some nice lucrative deals to some of their mates, which shouldn't be forgotten. And they sat on, the asylum numbers building. I think you're absolutely right, Frank. I think people are so pissed off. They don't want to hear the nuances of the fact that, Brexit caused a huge spike in legal migration from countries from further away, which meant people wanted to bring their families. Boris Johnson lowered the threshold for earnings to allow people to come here. So all of those things, which we know, but that doesn't help you if you've got what used to be a nice Travelodge down the end of the road is now full of blokes who you don't recognise, speaking a foreign language, wandering around aimlessly and, looking threatening to some people. So the government absolutely have got to do something. I mean, they cancelled the contract to use an old RAF base. I can't remember where it was. And the government cancelled that as soon as they got into office, which probably was a little bit premature, because those are the sort of places that they need to be putting people. They're badly run, they're appalling conditions, but that's about the people they have the contracts with, whether it's G4S or Serco or whoever it is. There's one down the road from me, Manston, which has been, regularly in the press. And of course, it's where Robert Jenrick, when he was immigration minister, ordered somebody to paint over the cartoons in the bit that looked after unaccompanied children because he didn't want to be too welcoming. I mean, that tells you all you need to know, really, doesn't it? So the government needs to get a crack on. They also need to be telling people these are the number of people that we have processed this week. It's this huge backlog. And as you said, you get houses of multiple occupation. Nobody wants those either. Nobody wants a street full, particularly when you've got these figures out this morning for my local council here, £50 million a year on temporary accommodation for local people on a housing list being sent to the most appalling conditions, private landlords. So, if the private landlords are going to make more money through a deal with the Home Office with a bunch of asylum seekers who aren't going to complain about the rats and the rot and the damp and everything else, which one are you going to do? So there's a whole load of layers on this, but the government does need to be seen to be doing something pretty quickly. I think Jenrick would be a disaster for the Conservative Party. I think Cleverly could rebuild them. We need a good Conservative Party. We need a good opposition. And we're still, 3 and a bit years away from an election. Anything could happen. Reform may crumble.
Yeah, I mean, my instinct tells me that the Conservative Party membership being what it is, and they will ultimately, I assume, make the decision, although MPs could, of course, do what Conservative MPs have done in the past. If they are particularly opposed to a Jenrick leadership, then they will sort that out. But I think if it goes to the membership, average age 78 or something, I think it is now, the Conservative Party membership, Jenrick would win it. I don't think it would be good for the Tory Party. Ultimately, I think they would be swallowed up by reform, because Jenrick's trying to out-reform reform, and as we've said before, very difficult, if nigh impossible, to do that. So we wait and see. But I think my view of, people have asked me about what I think in terms of the future of the Conservative Party is. Jim made the point, they're at a bit of a crossroads now, and if they go and chase the right, then I think it'd be difficult for them, because Farage will have them for breakfast. I think if you put a leader of the opposition, credible leader of the opposition, someone like Cleverly in post, and then you've got Starmer, you've got Ed Davey, you've got the official opposition leader, all challenging some of the crap that Farage comes out with, that would be a much stronger way of which the Conservatives could get their brand back on track. But as I say, I don't think their party membership will go for that. Before we finish on the economy, Jim's agitating to come in there. It's little.
No, I was just saying, in addition, we may have Mr. Corbyn and Mr. Polanski for the Greens, but not for today, perhaps.
No, we'll do that though. We will come back to that. It's all about the fragmentation of party politics in this country and across Europe, actually, isn't it? And whether or not some political party over the next few years will emerge in the same way as Macron's party did, where progressives and liberals sort of say, well, we've had enough of this, because we always talk about this big surge of reform support. An awful lot of that, not all of it, but an awful lot of it is former Tory voters, certainly right wing. If you combine the votes of the Greens, the Liberal Democrats, the Labour Party, and even the Conservatives, because there'll be a lot of Conservatives, as you say, Jim, who are one nation, there's still in my view, majority of people in this country who are liberal with a small L, progressive, don't want to see us go to the extremes of a Trump administration. But the first past the post system, well, it lends itself, as we saw only a year ago, to a government being elected with 33% of the vote with a massive majority. So therein is the dilemma. So we won't wait and see. Who is the President Macron of the UK? Jim,
I don't know.
Someone coming back into politics.
Well, I was going to say perhaps there are one or two gentlemen in the north of England of centrist sort of views, some more contemporarily in active politics, some with a past history in politics who could be that person.
You never know, Jim. Never say never, as I once
said. Is that your statement, said. Frank?
That's never said.
He's running, Joe. He's running.
Yeah, I've got to set a new party up. Right, last but not least, the economy, and some good news for Rachel Reeves this week. I mean, it was dismissed by some of the right-wing press, but actually the economy grew by 0.3%, which was higher than was projected. And therefore, over the last 12 months, the UK has been the best performing economy in the G7, which of course was one of Keir Starmer's pledges. Interest rates have come down, as we spoke briefly about last week, and all of a sudden Rachel Reeves is starting to come forward in a more robust fashion, Joe. She's been very much talking up the economy, saying this talk of a 40 billion black hole is nonsense, my budget will be fine, and full steam ahead. So what are you making of it all?
Well, yeah, she seems to have got herself back on a bit of a better track. She needs to keep telling people so that we can all say we're the fastest growing economy in the G7. Instead of, people come out with the same tropes time and time again: national insurance on employers, inheritance tax for farmers, winter fuel. We do it as well. But actually, we do need to look at the bigger picture. I think there are real concerns about the jobs market. There is still, a very, very slow hiring. And I think that's about uncertainty. I think, obviously the weather has been lovely in some parts of the country, and that's been a massive boost to hospitality and tourism, which is good. That might make people feel more comfortable, more confident. Inflation figures are out on Wednesday, roughly expected to be about 4.5%. I think the big problem is going to come in the autumn. This is going to sound really boring, but this has been such a terrible summer that the crops and the harvest have been dreadful, which means that the price of food is going to be really, really high, or there are going to be shortages. So, I mean, for instance, broccoli yields are down 50% in this country. Well, you know, we eat an awful lot of broccoli. So those are the sort of things that as the kids go back to school, as autumn comes, people think about putting the heating on. They think about, you know, the cost of school dinners, school uniforms, all of that stuff. It's how you feel as much as anything. But in broader terms, any good news has got to be good because it gives business confidence, and that means investment, and that means stability. But, you know, the government's got to keep at it. They've got a long way to go. And I think the other thing that Jackie Smith was talking about last week, and it's really, really important, is this need to train people up for the jobs that we need them to do. And what the government mustn't do is fall into the trap of bailing out crappy universities because they're failing. They should have probably never been universities in the first place, and use that money instead to get people trained up to be carpenters and plumbers and electricians and bricklayers, and the things that we actually need.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more in terms of that last point. The other piece of good news that Rachel Reeves had, which probably went under the radar for most people, but this idea that we'd had a mass exodus of millionaires has proved to be false as well, Jim. So far fewer people have left the UK than people have been suggesting. So again, you know, in terms of the optics, it has been a good week for Rachel Reeves.
Yes, not bad. I mean, I think you're right about this. You know, millionaires threatening to leave. You know, there's a lot of things that they absolutely love about this country, and whatever economic effect Rachel Reeves' proposals have on their lifestyle, there are a whole lot of other reasons why they want to stay here. I mean, just to put a slight dampener on Rachel's increasing confidence, you know, there are worrying signs. I mean, vacancies, for instance, are continuing to fall very rapidly. And you're looking around for the things that are actually going to bring growth. I've not heard recently Angela Rayner repeating her promise to build 1.5 million houses. There was a worrying statistic
in the news
last
today,
week.
Jim. In the news today, in fact, it was the Chancellor herself saying that she's going to bugger off all this objections to planning applications because of newts, frogs, and bats. So no, they are ploughing on with that. And again, you know, this is the problem, isn't it? You know, you don't get headlines for those sort of statements, but behind the scenes, no, I rest assured, Jim, Angela Rayner is burrowing away at that, and legislation will be brought forward in the autumn.
Yes, and therefore you'd be surprised that one little snippet here, that the production of concrete is its lowest level since 1963, which doesn't suggest that at the moment there are housing things going on. But I mean, I think it goes to Joe's point. We need to train the people to actually do this massive house building program. But the planning reforms, you know, will be interesting. I mean, I think we're all agreed that it's important the way the budget is framed, because if it can be framed as another attack on business, that's going to be very, very unfortunate. Rachel's got to try. She's got to find a way in a very difficult situation of raising more money, but not hammering business again. Otherwise, she will be in trouble.
Okay, well, we bring the conversation to a close, and just a further example, if you ever needed one, that even when you can announce the fact that the UK has been the fastest growing economy in the past 12 months, one of our podcasters can say, well, it's been an okay week for the Chancellor. And we wonder why people don't want to go into politics anymore, for fuck's sake.
Can I just ask about millionaires leaving the country? Where is millionaire Jim Hancock talking to us from this morning? Is that your Monaco vault hole, Jim?
He's in
No, it's an ancestral home that my grandparents bought over 100 years ago.
That doesn't answer the question. Which country?
Well, that's as far as my statement is going to go, I'm afraid, Miss Phillips.
Well, I think we
really have to be
need
satisfied
know.
with that.
Right, let me draw this nonsense to a close. And listen, next week it's Bank Holiday Monday, so we're going to have a break because I think us three are all struggling to persuade our families that doing an hour on a podcast on a bank holiday is a good idea. So we're going to have a break next Monday, be back the following week, and we will be looking ahead then, of course, to the new parliamentary session, to party conferences, all sorts of things happening. And I would urge you to go to the Downtown in Business website, all the W's, downtowninbusiness.com, to see some of the fabulous events that we have coming up as well. We've got a property and regeneration conference in Manchester with lots of chief executives and local authority leaders, mayors as well, in attendance. We're going to do a parliamentary reception with the Mayor of the West Midlands, Richard Parker, and the three cities of Birmingham, Wolverhampton and Coventry, alongside all of those other places in the West Mids as well. And what else do we have coming up in
Manchester
September?
Business
the
Awards.
City of Manchester Business Awards, of course, James. And so lots happening in the autumn. So as I say, do go onto our website, all the W's, downtowninbusiness.com, and book your tickets for those events. It's been great to have your company. Enjoy the next fortnight, and do look out for some positive news for Rachel Reeves, because we have given her some stick over the past few months, and whereas Jim's always come very much to the rescue of the snitch, he's not been as kind today to Rachel Reeves. Have a great week, everyone. We'll have a great fortnight, everyone, and let's hope by the next time we sit down as well, Plymouth Argyle have recorded their first win in League One. Happy listening, everyone. Thanks for joining us. See you soon.